Hey guys, I will wish you a good morning because it's morning here. I don't know when you'll access this lecture and when you'll be working on things, but I will say good morning nonetheless. So we're going to go ahead and start our discussion of medieval literature. That's what we're going to be diving into next. We're kind of skipping over the Roman Empire, not because Roman literature isn't important or interesting, but there is a lot of similarity between Roman literature and Greek literature. Thematically, there are some differences. Romans tend to emphasize a sense of duty and honor and self-control a little bit more than the Greeks. There is kind of a different set of Roman values, but when you get down to the stories, there are a lot of the same characters. For instance, the Romans use the same gods and goddesses as major players in their stories. They have different names for them. For instance, Zeus becomes Jupiter, Aphrodite becomes Venus, Hera becomes Juno, Hermes becomes Mercury, but they're still some of the same major characters and same major players in the stories. And so there are a lot of kind of similarities as far as storytelling and what's going on between the Greek literature and the Roman literature. So I feel like you've gotten a taste for that kind of that period in history, and you've gotten a feel for those sorts of things. So we're going to move on to the medieval period, which begins during and after the fall of the Roman Empire, and really focuses more on what is initially a much more northern and Western European culture. And we'll talk a little bit about the historical context there. We've been dwelling more in the south of Europe with Greece, and then Rome obviously is more in the south of Europe in Italy. And so we're moving to a little bit more northern and western. Now, eventually, that northern and western culture spreads into the southern parts of Europe as well, into Italy and France and Spain and so forth. So it does end up becoming kind of a all-European culture, but medieval culture begins more in the north and the west, and it actually lasts the longest there. The medieval period ends later in the north and the west. So we're going to be diving into medieval literature. We're going to be reading several different things, though we will be kind of focusing on three countries in particular, France and England and Italy. That's mostly where the literature that we're going to read comes from. From France, we're going to read some of the early medieval romances of Chrétien de Troyes, who is a French writer and is responsible for kind of the invention of the courtly romance style. And we'll talk about what romance means. It's not romance in the terms that we would think of romance today. So although what we would call romance, romantic love, is an element, certainly in the medieval romances, it is not what romance means in medieval Europe. And so we'll talk about that. When we get to England, we will look a little bit at some of Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which is particularly the stories of King Arthur and his knights at the Round Table. And we will see that some of those stories happen, well, they don't happen, they're always set in England. But some of those stories are written by French writers because the stories about King Arthur spread from England across medieval Europe, and he becomes a very popular character all over Europe, not just in England. So though the stories always take place in England, they are sometimes written by French authors, and Chrétien de Troyes does write about King Arthur as well. But kind of the full story of King Arthur is found in Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, and we won't read the entire thing, but we will read part of it. And then when we get into Italy, which is more towards, we'll be looking more towards the end of the medieval period, we will be reading some stuff, some selections from the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. And so, well, you can kind of see this book. There we go. This is a very large copy of it. It's very big. But that's because it has very large text inside. And it's also there's like 2 translations of it here, so side by side. But we will be reading some sections from Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. And that is, many people know Dante's Inferno. That's the part that people most typically read, but I think there is a lot of beauty and actually a lot more spiritual insight in parts 2 and 3 of the Divine Comedy, because it is a 3-part work. The Inferno is his journey through hell. This is an imaginary journey, obviously, his imaginary journey through hell, which represents part of his spiritual journey, his recognition of his own sin, and then his journey through purgatory. Dante Alighieri was a Catholic, so he believed in purgatory, which symbolically represents his coming to repentance after he's become aware of his sin, and then his journey through paradise, which represents symbolically salvation. And there's actually a lot of spiritual insight in parts 2 and 3 as well. So we're going to treat all 3 parts at some level and not just the Inferno, because I think there's a lot to be learned there beyond simply reading about the gruesome goriness of his vision of hell. So let's go ahead and dive into a little bit more about medieval literature. All right, so I asked you guys a little bit earlier to comment on the discussion thread that asked you to think about what 3 things first come to mind when you think of the word medieval. And I've been enjoying seeing some of your responses and your reasons for that. And obviously some of that is based in historical reality and some of it is based in fantasy, because we have a lot of fantasy stories that are kind of set in a medieval period. One thing that's kind of both fantasy and historical reality that came to my mind, and so I'm just going to share a few things that come to my mind when we think about that. One of those is castles. Certainly we have historical castles, but there's a lot of that in fantasy and fairy tales as well. Knights are one of the other things that I think of, and again, there's a lot of fantasy element to knights, but knights were actual historical thing, and they were kind of the backbone of medieval society. And so we'll be talking about how all of kind of society kind of hinged on the knight class during the medieval era. And that will in turn explain for us why so many stories feature knights, right? Because they're such an important part of society. Oftentimes, when we think of medieval, we think of fairy tales. There are many, many fairy tales that are set during this medieval period. And so princesses, of course, come to mind, and fairy tales as well. Though most fairy tales aren't actually written during the medieval period, but they're often set during the medieval period. So the medieval period has had an impact on literature in fairy tales by being that time, that once upon a time, that many fairy tale stories are set. Dragons. I think I saw that somebody mentioned this one as well, and many stories written during the medieval period feature dragons, whether they're as a symbol or as an actual character. There is this kind of mythic lore about dragons that is present in the medieval period itself. And then, of course, much of our fantasy literature also features dragons later on. Jousting. This is another historical thing, but another thing that features in a lot of stories, not only that were written during the medieval period, but also that are written about the medieval period. So hopefully you're beginning to see a little bit of how, although the medieval period only produced so much literature, though it was actually a wide, rich variety of literature, and there's a lot of texture and interest to the literature. But the medieval period has had an impact on literature far beyond what was actually written in that period. We are continuing to write things set in the medieval period. It's a period that fascinates us. And so we will be reading literature that's set during the medieval period, And there's much literature, and it's very interesting. But it has a much longer impact, this period, on literature and literary development as well. It's one of our favorite time periods to write about. So, along with jousting, that is one of the favorite activities. And if you've ever watched medieval TV shows, you've probably seen jousting in a TV show that's set during the medieval period. There's just there's a great deal of kind of fun in that idea of the competition, although in reality it's quite a brutal competition and people did actually die. All right, so those are a few things that came to my mind when I was thinking about the word medieval. And so you guys had some great answers as well that I have seen so far. A few of you have not posted yet as of when I'm recording this video. But what I've seen so far, you guys had some really interesting things. And it's interesting to think about all the different things that impact how we think of the medieval period. So I wanted to start with another name for the medieval period. A lot of people refer to the medieval period as the Middle Ages. And so that's an interesting name, right? The Middle Ages. Because if we call it the Middle Ages, what is it in the middle of, right? What does it come between? And so a lot of people have considered the Middle Ages, that middle, they think of it kind of as a downtime, as a sort of dark age, as a time period that was just kind of a waiting period between the classical period of Greece and Rome and then the rediscovery of everything that Greece and Rome had to offer that happens during the Renaissance. It's a very interesting thing because that seems to suggest that the most legitimate cultures and societies were Greece and Rome, that they were the pinnacle and they were the achievement. And certainly Greece and Rome have had a huge impact on who we are today. But that gives a lot of preference to Greece and Rome. And so that idea of the Middle Ages means it's just kind of a waiting period, that there's not really anything valuable currently going on. And that would be kind of like saying that while we're away from school, that there's no way that anything valuable could happen, which I don't think is true, right? While we're in this, what might seem like a waiting period, while we're waiting for these coronavirus quarantines to end, I think that God can actually do a lot in our midst, right? I think he can do a lot for us as a community and in your lives and in your families and in our country as well. And so I think it's a mistake to label any period just as kind of a waiting period, right? Things can be active and happening, and that's certainly true for medieval Europe during the time period. It's a mistake to call this like a dark age, a waiting period, something that's not happening, because there's actually a lot of really interesting cultural and artistic and literary development that's going on during this time period. And this is actually a very rich period in literary history, and as I've already shown you, has had a huge impact on the literature that we continue to write. And so a lot of people are kind of turning away from calling the medieval period the Middle Ages because there's an increasing recognition that this period, though it's not as directly connected to ancient Greece and ancient Rome or to the Renaissance, there's a lot of value and culture that comes out of this time period that is uniquely its own and is really interesting and really important. So of course the medieval period begins with the fall of Rome. The medieval period is not something that's easy to date the beginning and end of because Rome doesn't fall all in a day, right? And so the medieval period has a kind of gradual beginning. But it does begin as the Roman Empire begins to crumble. And the Roman Empire begins to crumble simply because it was stretched too thin. It had become large. It had taken over so much land. You can see on the slide here the extent of the Roman Empire at one point. It stretched all the way up to England in the north, and then all the way down to North Africa in the south, all the way across to Portugal in the west, and then Syria in the east. So really the entire Mediterranean region, and then most of Europe, right, was under the control of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire had really just stretched itself so thin that it couldn't economically, politically manage that vast of an empire. And we've seen that that's happened with other empires in the past. When they just became so large, they couldn't maintain it based on the technology and the government styles that they had at the time. So here's a little map of the Roman Empire at its height in the 3rd century AD before it begins to kind of decline and split and so forth. So you can see here all the way up to England in the north. And this right here, I've actually been here. This is what we call Hadrian's Wall. And Hadrian's Wall was basically a wall built by one of the Roman emperors to keep the Scots from attacking the Roman territory of England. And so that has kind of become, nowadays it's still in England, it's not in Scotland, but it was the old border between England and Scotland. And then of course you can see stretching down here. They don't go far into Africa. It's just the northern tip of Africa. But a little bit into Saudi Arabia as well. And then you can see there's this contested area here that sometimes was controlled by the Romans and sometimes by the Parthian Empire. And so that's that whole region over here. So you can see this was a large territory of land, and over time it became difficult for them to maintain that whole empire. So the thing that happens as they begin to not be able to control the whole empire is the empire actually splits. And if you've studied world history, you may have studied a little bit about this, but there becomes the Western Empire, which has its capital in Rome, where the capital had been for years. And then there's the Eastern Empire, which had its capital in Constantinople. And the capital of Rome had moved for a time to Constantinople under Emperor Constantine, when he was kind of trying to create a new empire, and he had introduced Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Despite the fact that this attempted split kind of stabilizes for a little bit of time, the Roman Empire ceases to be able to control its northern border, and they experience a lot of pressure because there are a lot of Germanic tribes who begin to move into what was traditionally Roman territory. And so we're going to talk about that here. Who were those Germanic tribes? Why were they moving in? And was it really a barbarian invasion? So the Germanic tribes are a people group. Certainly Germany gets its name from Germanic tribes, but Germanic peoples today, the people of Germanic descent, are not just from Germany. There are people all across Western Europe who are of Germanic descent, right? So the French, the Spanish, the Germans, the English, the Italians, all of these people have Germanic descent. The Portuguese as well have Germanic descent in their ancestry. So don't think of just Germany when you think of Germanic peoples, right? The Germanic peoples have come from many different places in Europe, even more northern Europe, like what we would call Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland. Those are Germanic people groups as well. So these Germanic people groups, what was happening is the Roman Empire was kind of falling and was actually having a population decrease. And there was a lot of kind of lessening of the population of Roman citizens. The Germanic people groups are experiencing this population boom. There's kind of a sudden population explosion. And so their land that they have traditionally lived on, which is in more northern Europe, is is no longer able to sustain them. So there begins this kind of migration. And as they begin to migrate into Roman territories, of course, hostilities and conflict and battle erupt. And the Germanic people were fierce warriors. They were very battle hardened, and that was a part of their society. But some historians have mislabeled this kind of time period as a period of barbaric invasions or barbarian invasions. Problem with that is that implies two things. It implies that the Germanic tribes were somehow less important and less civilized than the Romans. Which in some ways they were, in some ways they weren't, right? We've talked about kind of right, wrong, and different before, and there were certainly differences there, but the other thing that implies is that it was a planned invasion, that they were trying to take over the Roman Empire. And for most of this kind of expansion of the Germanic peoples, that wasn't the case at all. They were simply looking for new land to support this growing population. And they weren't trying to invade and cripple the Roman Empire. Now, towards the end, when the city of Rome itself falls, there is kind of a planned invasion there. But it's a much more complex and complicated issue than that. And so it's really just kind of a mass migration that's marked by sporadic hostilities. So Germanic historians don't actually call this the barbarian invasions. They use the Germanic word, the Volkerwanderung, which literally means the wandering of the peoples, right? The Germanic peoples were kind of wandering in search of new land. And of course, hostilities and war and conflict did come along with that process. But it's a rather more complicated issue. But this is really the beginning of the medieval period, is the emergence of these Germanic peoples. And these Germanic peoples are the groups that are going to set what become the modern nations of Europe. They settle in different places and create what we know today. They create these people groups and tribes and eventually kingdoms, which eventually become countries that are the countries in Europe that we know today. And so they define the medieval period through their wandering and expansion. That's really what makes this medieval period begin, is the rise of the Germanic peoples, and they define medieval culture. So here's just a quick overview of where a lot of these Germanic tribes resettle. We're talking resettling, right? So new countries. So there's not really a resettling of Germany, right? Germany is a Germanic country, but they existed in Germany already, so they didn't resettle there. The Scandinavian countries are Germanic people groups as well, but they didn't resettle there. They kept their land. Those were places where Rome didn't really have a presence. But as they migrate and they resettle in some places that used to be controlled by Rome. Italy. There are three Germanic tribes that settle in Italy: the Lombards, the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths. Now, of course, the Latin people, who were the Roman people, were not completely wiped out. And so the Lombards, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths intermarry with them, and that creates the medieval Italian culture, right? So there still is some Latin and Roman heritage in Italy, but there's also this Germanic people group that come in as well. France is settled by the Visigoths and the Franks, and the Frank tribe is where we get the name France from. They become the most prominent tribe in the area of France. Spain is also settled by the Visigoths. And if you've done art history or anything like that, you may have studied Gothic architecture and so forth that arises in the medieval period. And that Gothic architecture comes from the Visigoths as well as the Ostrogoths in Italy. That's where we get that name for Gothic architecture and then later Gothic literature. And then England is settled by some completely different tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, who probably came over from the area of Scandinavia. And it is the Angles that give their name to England. At first, England is named Angleland, right? And over time, Anglaland, and then Englaland, and then England, right? So that's how that name develops. So that's how we begin to see these Germanic tribes shape what we know today as the modern nations of Europe. One of the other major influences that the Germanic tribes have on the medieval period is the development of the feudal system. So when the Roman Empire collapses, you've lost the primary political structures that Europe had at the time. So there's no structure except for what the Germanic tribes bring in. When the city of Rome collapses, there's no central political system. But the Germanic tribes did have a system by which they functioned. And as they settle in new places and do a little bit of mingling with the people who used to be in the Roman Empire, this system that's based on the tribal structure of the Germanic tribes emerges. And we call it the feudal system. And that becomes the dominant political system of Europe during the medieval period. And it's really important to understand the literature of the medieval period because the social classes that are formed by the feudal system are very prominent in medieval literature. So basically, the Germanic tribal structures had the system that involved what we call the act of vassalage. Basically, that means that one person became a vassal or a servant of another person. So basically, one lord of something would swear allegiance to another lord of something. So it was a hierarchical system. I'll show you a pyramid structure here in a minute that kind of explains it. But at the top, you would usually have a king, right? And the king would have lords who would swear allegiance to the king. In exchange for their allegiance, he would grant them certain privileges. And the Germanic term for those privileges was feuds, which is where we get the term feudal system. And so it's a system of exchange, right? Everybody benefits at some level from this system. You pledge your loyalty to someone who is above you. In turn, that person who is above you responds by giving you some sort of privilege or feud. And it's this whole system that gives rise to kings and knights and the code of chivalry, and all of that sort of stuff comes out of the system that was the political structure at a very basic sense when the Germanic tribes were just wandering around. But as they settle, it becomes a more elaborate and more well-established political system. So here's a quick pyramid diagram of the feudal system. And if you take a look here, this kind of highlights what's going on in this system and the system of exchange. And so I'm just going to highlight some things here. So at the top, you obviously have the king. And the king is not going to be a vassal to anyone, except for perhaps in medieval society, he was kind of seen as a vassal to the church, right? The king was answerable to the Roman Catholic Church, which is the only part of Rome that kind of survives the fall of Rome is the church. And all of the Germanic tribes pretty quickly become Christian once they settle in these areas. And so the king was kind of held responsible to the church, but it was a little bit of a dicey relationship, and there was oftentimes conflict about who really held the authority, the king or the church. This is why eventually when the United States is founded, we have no official state religion because of all the problems that kind of came about when the church was too involved in politics. And I think that's actually a very good biblical idea. I don't think, biblically speaking, there's a whole lot of support for the church to be too heavily involved in politics. We really shouldn't get concerned with power. That's not what the church is about. So, but the king is at the top of the pyramid, right? He's not a vassal to anyone. But then you have the next class of lords, right? And the lords promise loyalty to the king. They swear allegiance and promise loyalty to the king. And they also are supposed to supply military aid. So they supply knights for when the king has to go to war, right? So they would go to war with the king and their men would go to war with the king as well. Because the king is not going to be able to maintain a large enough army to go to war with a whole other country on his own, right? So he relies on the lords to supply their men. In exchange for their loyalty and their military support, the king does give them something. He gives them a very large portion of his country for them to rule over. Obviously, the king has the largest portion, and the king would usually give some land to the church as well. But he does give them a fairly large portion of land called a fief, and says that they are lord over that fief and over any peasants who live on that fief and who provide services like blacksmithing or farming or something of that nature. Right? So they rule over those people and over that part of land. The lords, of course, because they're required to provide military aid to the king should he need it, they need to have warriors, soldiers, right? And that's where knights come in. So the lords would then, parcel out portions of their land, or they would keep some of their land for themselves, but then they would give smaller sections of their land called manors to knights to rule over. And so they would grant kind of someone the title of knight, or the king would grant that person the title of knight. They would have these knights, they would give these knights land to live on. They would also give them the peasants on their land for them to rule over. And that would be what the knight would receive from the lords, right? The lords also granted a level of protection to the knights, right? If somebody attacked the knight, the lord and his men would all go and kind of avenge them and keep them safe and so forth. And so that is what the lords give to the knights. In return, the knights provide military protection and military aid to the lords. And eventually up the chain to the king as well. Now, then you have the common people on the bottom class, on the bottom of the social pyramid. The peasants or serfs didn't really have a choice in whether or not they were going to be loyal to their knight and their lord and their king. That was kind of expected of them. But it wasn't that they didn't receive benefits, right? And so the knights either give to the peasants jobs or land to farm and live on, houses, shelter. They did provide something for those people, as well as the thing that the peasants were most concerned about was protection, because the medieval period was a rather unstable period in history, and there were lots of invasions and attacks and so forth. And so the peasants wanted to know that they were protected, that they weren't left to fend for themselves. And so they receive food and shelter and protection and employment, essentially, from the knights and lord and king who are over them, right? That's kind of the way that it worked. And if you were a farmer, it wasn't a terrible gig, right? You farmed, a certain portion of your crop went to the knight or the lord or the king, and then the rest of it was available for you to feed your family and live off of. So it may sound terrible, and it wasn't ideal, but at the time, the peasants didn't necessarily feel like this was a bad life, right? It's a bad life by our modern standards, but for them, they felt that this was an acceptable arrangement. That, of course, changes later in history as things change historically, but at the time, it was an acceptable arrangement for them. So they, in turn, farm the land, provide food and services, and pay rent to the knights and eventually the lords and the kings on up through the chain. So that's kind of how the feudal system pyramid works. And that's important to understanding some of the literature because those social classes do, they do appear and play a prominent role in medieval literature. Now I do want to point out in particular this idea of the knights as the centerpiece of medieval society, because really the king and the lords can't do what they do without military support, and so the knights are needed for that military support. But the peasants can't do their jobs in assurance of safety without the military protection provided by the knights. So the knights are really giving a very valuable service both ways, both up the social ladder and down the social ladder. And so that's why the knights become kind of the centerpiece of medieval society, and why they become some of the primary characters in medieval literature, because they're really the backbone of that society. The society, whole society, depends on that social class. One of the ways, one of the things that comes out of the medieval period, because of the feudal system and this kind of family identification of lords and kings and knights and so forth, is this strong sense of family heritage and family identity. That is, of course, present in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but it kind of comes to a new level because of the way that the feudal system works, and it becomes a matter of intense pride what your heritage is, right? Heritage was important for other people, but there's a whole new system of family pride that comes out of that, and that has impacted some aspects of the modern world today, right? Of course, family pride has become less important for us in the modern world, but there are certain social systems that have been set up in Europe, and to a small extent even in the United States, that have been impacted by that. And one of the things that comes about as a matter of that family pride is this coat of arms, as kind of this symbol of your family and your lineage and your heritage. It was also a very practical thing, right? Because people were fighting in full armor, you couldn't see their faces, you couldn't recognize them without some identifying mark. And so the coat of arms would have been painted on a knight's shield so that you would know whether that was a friend or a foe. You would know the coats of arms of your allies. And you would, so if you didn't recognize the coat of arms, or you would know the coat of arms of your enemies, right? If you didn't recognize the coat of arms, you would know that that was an enemy. If you recognized it and you knew it was a friend, you wouldn't fight them, right? And it keeps you from accidentally killing the people who are on your side, which would be very problematic. So it becomes this, this whole kind of tradition, right, to have this coat of arms, and kings and knights and families are identified by their coats of arms. And there's a lot of decoration, there are a lot of rules that kind of go along with the coats of arms, and it's very interesting. I would encourage you, if you're not sure, look up your family name and see if you have any sort of European heritage in your background. Look it up and see if your family has a coat of arms. At first, it's only knights, but eventually other members of society begin to develop coats of arms for their families. You hear the bell. You hear that the bell system is still working, even though we're not running normal class schedule. But I would encourage you to check it out. See if your family has a coat of arms. And I would be interested, if they do, for you to share what it is. Do a little research and see if your family has one, if you've got any sort of European heritage, or even if you were adopted into a family, but maybe your family may have European heritage even if you don't. See if you've got a family coat of arms for your family name. My family does actually have a family coat of arms, and I will show it here to you in a second. So this is the coat of arms for the Coates family. It's the Coates family coat of arms. There's lots of coat in there. And I actually remember this coat of arms. My grandfather had, my grandpa Coates had just the shield portion. He didn't have the full thing, but he had just the shield portion hanging in his house for many, many years. And so the three charging boars, the three white boars on a red background, I remember seeing that at my grandfather's house. This is a fuller coat of arms that includes the helmet, which is a rank marker, like what was your kind of level in medieval society. And then there's usually lots of fancy scrolls around the shield, a name at the bottom. And then usually there's a crest on top of the helmet that is an animal of some sort. And so you can see for the Coates family, it's a swan. So I like my coat of arms. I think it's kind of cool. I will open up a discussion thread that's not required, but if you find that your family has a coat of arms, go post it there, right? Look up your last name online, see if there's a coat of arms for your family name. and then get a picture of it and post in that discussion thread. And it'll be fun to see if people have a family coat of arms, what those look like. Here's just a little bit more basic diagram. Maybe I'll post this diagram on the discussion thread. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now, but it does show kind of how the whole coat of arms was kind of broken down, and some typical elements of the coat of arms that you might see. So maybe I'll post that on the discussion thread as well if you want to look at that in greater detail. All right, so let's get back to what was happening with how medieval society was being formed by the rise of the Germanic peoples. So the Germanic peoples determine most of the culture and the ideas and the values of medieval Europe. But there is still a mixing of culture that goes on, right? The Roman Empire falls, but that doesn't mean that all of the Roman people were completely gone, right? And there were some certain things that impacted the Germanic tribes as they moved in. So Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire in AD 353 under Emperor Constantine. And one of the things that happens when the Germanic tribes move in is that Christianity doesn't disappear or even become persecuted. In fact, most of the Germanic tribes end up converting. There are missionaries who kind of speak to the kings and leaders of the Germanic tribes, and they convert, they become Christian. And so there's that aspect of it that is something that was not totally Germanic before, right? What this also meant was that most of the Germanic tribes, as they became Christian and as they started attending church, began to adopt the Latin language for certain parts of their lives, because it was the official language of the Western Church, right? It was the official language of the Roman Catholic Church. And so the Latin language doesn't completely die out. That was the language spoken by the Roman Empire, but it doesn't completely die out because the church continues to use Latin. And so some of the Germanic people begin to learn Latin because of the church. And in fact, there are some languages that show significant impact of Latin on the development of modern European languages. And scholars think that French and Spanish and Italian in particular arose from the merging of Latin with the Germanic language, and how the Germanic peoples kind of learned Latin imperfectly, and so there's kind of this merging of the languages that takes place. That is somewhat true for English as well, although English follows a slightly different trajectory of the development of the language. But Latin does have an impact on English, certainly, because of the church as well. What this means, though, because Latin was not used universally, right? It merges and the cultures merge, but the church continues to learn Latin and use Latin, and education primarily happens through the church. The church was primarily responsible for education during the medieval period. But not everybody was getting educated, and not everybody was heavily involved in church. So there ends up being these two different tracks, and almost two different cultures, and two different strata of society that emerged during the medieval period. There's a learned culture, and that they primarily deal in Latin that was used in the church and educated circles. And then there's the popular culture, the common people, and they speak the vernacular languages, which are more the European Germanic languages. Not as we know them today, but that are the ancestors of the languages that we know today. And so there's kind of becomes this divide in culture that didn't exist really under the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks and the Romans, we talked about with the Greeks, there wasn't a clear split between like this is the educated portion of the population and this is not. There was a sense that kind of anybody from slaves to political leaders in ancient Greece was educated. And so there wasn't that kind of split and divide in ancient Greece. But now, because of what has happened with the language, there becomes this sort of divide, and that has informed a lot of our historical development, both in Europe and in the United States, this kind of divide between the learned and the unlearned, right? And that's something that we're still struggling with today, and that has its roots in these language issues, actually, that happened during the medieval period. Which is really interesting, and it reminds us that language is actually important. Like, language actually has an impact on our lives. It caused a split in medieval Europe that we're still dealing with the ramifications of today. So if people ever tell you language is not important, tell them baloney. Later, these cultures begin to merge and intersect more. When the Renaissance comes around, more and more people start to get educated, and we become on the trajectory that we're still on today, right? Where we are slowly getting rid of that kind of educated and non-educated divide. But it's not something that we've completely done yet. So, despite the fact that Latin was the language of the educated circles, that didn't mean that language and literature were not used in the more Germanic circles and in Germanic society. So that still is a definite part of Germanic culture, is language and literature and storytelling. And in fact, as the medieval period progresses, more and more people become interested in actually writing in the vernacular languages, like French and Spanish and Italian and English and German. They become more interested in writing in those languages, and they begin to, Latin writing becomes primarily just religious or academic writing, right? Storytelling in the medieval period begins to shift from the Latin to the vernacular. And so the Germanic portion, the vernacular portion of the literature, is actually what we're going to be looking at. There is Latin literature that's written during the medieval period, but really all the stories that have had a huge impact on us from the medieval era are all written in the vernacular languages. They're Germanic contributions. And that's why I say that really more than the Latin, though the Latin did exist, it was the Germanic that set the tone and the culture and the artistic standard, and even the politics of this time period, right? It was the Germanic peoples that had that impact. And so the Germanic and the vernacular languages are the ones that we get our medieval stories from. That is where almost all of the storytelling in the medieval era takes place. So, well, and I should mention as a side note, eventually during the medieval period, preachers stop preaching in Latin because they realize that the common people can't understand it. They start preaching in the vernacular languages as well, which only furthers the value of the vernacular languages. Now, sometimes you can see some blending of certain things between the Latin and the vernacular languages in medieval literature. Dante's Divine Comedy is a great example of this. He uses a lot of characters, either from the history of Greece and Rome or from their mythology in his Divine Comedy. You will see people like Odysseus, his Roman name is Ulysses, the Roman author Virgil, Aeneas, who is the primary character in the Roman epic, the Aeneid. There are other characters from Greek and Roman mythology in Dante's Divine Comedy. And Dante very much looks up to the Roman poet Virgil as his poetic inspiration. And so there's a Latin influence there, but Dante doesn't choose to write the Divine Comedy in Latin, even though he was an educated, learned man. He knew Latin. He could have written it in Latin, but he doesn't. He chooses to write it in the vernacular Italian. And so there is a definite sense of that these vernacular languages are beginning to be more valued than the Latin itself. People want the common people to be able to read what they've written, right? And so there's a merging of the Latin and the Germanic there. But then we have other genres of literature that are more heavily influenced by the Germanic tradition. The Germanic epics. Now, of course, we know that epic exists in ancient Greece and Rome, right? We read the Iliad, it's an epic, right? We read a bit of the Odyssey, it's an epic, right? Ancient Rome has the Aeneid, it's an epic. But the Greek and Roman epics are these very highly polished kind of literary sort of things. The Iliad and the Odyssey have roots in oral tradition, but they have a very different flavor from the Germanic epics. The Germanic peoples have epics and they write epics. They are firmly rooted in the oral tradition. The Aeneid is not, though the Iliad and the Odyssey might be. But the purpose is also different. The Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid wrestle with cultural identity issues and values and things like honor and duty, and the role of storytelling, and they're very intellectual at some level, right? Which is very indicative of Greek and Roman culture. The Germanic epics are much more indicative of Germanic culture in that they are battle-driven. They're meant to boost the soldiers' morale when they go off to war. Their verse is not highly polished. There's not as much craft going into it. It's a very irregular verse. Rhythm and rhyme don't follow standard patterns. So there is a very kind of different flavor, and the epics that are written during this time period in the medieval era are not, they're not the highly polished and intellectual kind of epics. They are a much more rough and ready, wartime, very Germanic epic. Some of the most famous ones that come from the medieval period, these epics, the Spanish poem of the Cid, which recounts the Spanish trying to take Spain back from the Muslim Moors who invaded. The French Song of Roland, which is also about the battle with the Muslim Moors, but is from the French perspective, and Charlemagne's nephew. It's kind of a tragedy about Charlemagne's nephew, Roland. And then the English epic Beowulf, which is not really about a war, but about a hero who fights monsters and becomes a king and all of that sort of thing. So those are some of the very Germanic epics, and they are very uniquely medieval, right? They don't really follow the tradition of the Greeks and the Romans. They are kind of their own thing. So I mentioned that the Spanish Song of the Cid and or Poem of the Cid and the Song of Roland recount the battle with the Muslims and the Moors. That happens in AD 711. The Muslims have conquered much of northern Africa and the Middle East, and they cross the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain, and they quickly conquer a lot of Spain. But their advance is stopped. They are kept from invading France by Charles Martel, who had a nickname, the Hammer. My video is covering up a little bit of the picture of him, but you can see him on top of a horse wielding a hammer in battle. He earned his nickname. He defeats them at the Battle of Tours in central France. And then what is known as Christendom at the time, the kingdoms who were primarily Christian, so France and Spain and so forth, launched the Reconquista, which tries to take Spain back from the invading Moors. And so the Visigothic kingdoms from northern Spain launched their attack and have some success. And then Charlemagne, who is the, I believe he's the grandson of Charles Martel the Hammer, he comes over from France to help them. And this obviously inspired literature. It also solidified the knights as an important part of medieval society, and eventually paved the way for a couple things that are important to literature. One is just for the knights to be a central part of the society, and so they're main characters in the stories, but also for a new piece that actually allows for cultural and literary and educational development. Because up until this point, medieval Europe has been characterized kind of by war. But after this, things begin to settle down, and that allows for this artistic and literary development to take place. So there is this sense of a new stability. Because of his work in helping to take Spain back from the Moors, the Pope crowns Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor in AD 800. Now, this didn't mean a whole lot politically. It didn't mean that Charlemagne was ruling over all of Europe. The other European nations still kept their sovereignty and their kings and queens and so forth. But it did serve as kind of a religious unification, and there was kind of a religious figurehead aside from the Pope. And it made Europe feel a little more unified, like they were together. It also signaled a peace, and so that the people could begin to focus more on cultural matters. They do some refining of the writing system. There's a new system called Carolingian minuscule, which is based on kind of more of a French style of writing that begins to be used to write both Latin and the vernacular languages. And it's a much easier system to use than the old Roman system. And so that begins to be adopted. There are new grammars that are written for Latin that kind of stabilize the development of the Latin language and allow for education to flourish, because there's now a standard version of Latin. But there are also, during this period of peace, there are new writings that come in the vernacular languages from the Germanic tradition, Provençal poetry in southern France, which gives rise to a couple things. The tradition of troubadours, who are these traveling musicians, singers, poets. They begin to write poems praising love, and they're usually performed in the court, so they're called courtly love poems. And this is a new tradition. Certainly poetry about love is not a new tradition, but this is a new tradition of love poetry that's very medieval in style. And it's not trying to imitate any of the earlier styles. It's a brand new style. And then you have a new kind of storytelling that is kind of pioneered by author Chrétien de Troyes, who works for Marie de Champagne in southern France. And he begins to write these stories about knights and their brave deeds and all of this sort of thing. And those stories become known as courtly romances or medieval romances. And though love often plays an element in these stories, that's not necessarily the focus. The focus is on the knights and their brave deeds and their quests and so forth. This is the quest story, the courtly romance. And so those are some new literary traditions that arise because there has become this time of peace. The peace lasts somewhat in Europe for a while, but it doesn't last worldwide, right? In AD 1095, Pope Urban II gives a call for the nations of Europe to go and take back the Holy Land from the Saracens, which were a group of Muslims. They had, of course, conquered Jerusalem and all of kind of the holy shrines that Christians considered sacred. And in a response that personally I do not really agree with, I don't think that we should ever be going to war in the name of Christ. I think that does actually a lot of damage, and I don't think it aligns with kind of the mission that Jesus gave us. I don't think that Jesus ever gave us a mission to go and fight and kill people. The question of war for other purposes might be open for discussion, but I don't really think that Christians should go to war for the sake of Jesus, right? I think that's not in line with what Jesus taught. But nevertheless, that's what happened, right? And Pope Urban II called the European kings and said, let's go take back the Holy Land. It was actually one of the most effective speeches given in world history, because he said he didn't expect much of a response, and he was overwhelmed by the response. The nations of Europe were like, yes, let's go do it. And so the first crusade was launched in 1096, and they went, and by 1099 they had regained control of Europe. It was this effective movement. Unfortunately, the first crusade was really the only one that was effective. The Muslims reorganized and reconquered. They regained Jerusalem by AD 1187. So Europe controlled Jerusalem for not quite 100 years, so it was some time, but the Muslims did reorganize and reconquer. Other crusades were issued, but they were less successful. The European lords bickered internally. They started to get more concerned about politics back in Europe, and they weren't really concerned about any unified international effort to take Jerusalem. Plus, morality with each passing crusade was horrendous, right? I mean, they were killing and raping women and children, and these knights who claimed they were Christians were doing very unchristian things, and so that was a major problem, and it's a real blot on Christian history that that we did this in the name of Christ. I think it's important to remember that probably a lot of these people were Christian in name only. They probably did not personally follow God. But that, of course, has caused a lot of people to have questions about Christianity. And I think it's important that we say, no, the Crusades were not a good thing. They were not a thing that should have happened. We do not support those. We don't think that that was something that Jesus would have wanted us to do. And I think it's important that the church says that. And so there's a continued conflict between the church and the various kingdoms and internally bickering. And so they're just, it was just not a good or positive situation, and the Crusades were not successful. And so, of course, they did not hold on to Jerusalem or any of the holy sites in the end. And so, by and large, politically speaking, and from all of their stated goals, the Crusades were a failure. However, the Crusades do have an effect on Europe, and some of that effect was positive. Now that they were such a brutal event and there were so many terrible things that happened, it seems strange to say that there were positive effects from the Crusades, but there were. When the knights and the kings came back from the Middle East, they brought with them spices and textiles from the Middle East that there began to be a demand for. And so actually there began to be a slightly, ever so slightly more positive relationship between Europe and the Middle East as trade began to be established, because people wanted goods that the Middle East had that Europe didn't have. And people in the Middle East wanted goods that Europe had that the Middle East didn't. And so trade routes are opened. And this leads to a growing merchant class, the bourgeois class, it was called in France. But this growing merchant class, which means that the common people can now earn a living, and they don't have to be entirely subject to the knights, right? They don't have to be serfs and peasants who just live off the land anymore. And so there's this growing merchant class, which leads to a growth in cities. Small towns begin to become larger trading centers. Larger towns become booming cities. And so there is this very quick development, and this leads also to increased education. As more and more people have money, they begin to be able to educate their children, right, or pursue education themselves. So education is gradually not becoming limited just to the most elite people in society, but people who are wealthy but may not be a lord or noble or knight are now being able to receive an education. And so by AD 1300, there are more than 14 universities that have been established in England. Two of the most prominent, the University of Paris, which was considered the most respectable university if you're going to study religion or philosophy, and then the University of Bologna in Italy, which was considered the most respected university if you're going to study law or rhetoric, which is the art of speaking. Of course, the development of education also has an impact on literary development, because as more and more people are educated, more and more people want to read, and so there's more and more demand for literature, right? And so literature begins to boom as a result of this as well. As I mentioned, more and more people were moving into towns and cities. This was a positive thing in many ways. Increased trade, greater wealth for the general population, more education. But there were problems as well. Many people who moved into the cities ended up in poverty, right? Close quarters resulted in plague. I know that that idea is on our mind right now, right? I mean, that's what we're doing with quarantining, is trying to not have a bunch of people living in close quarters. In medieval Europe, it was far, far worse. Close quarters, unsanitary conditions, rats coming off of ships, disease spreading everywhere, very high death rate in medieval Europe. And so those problems were exacerbated by people living in close quarters in unsanitary conditions in the city. I mean, you didn't have a toilet in your house, so what you did, you went into a pot or a bucket and then you dumped it out of your window onto the street in the day. We can understand why disease was all over the place. Like, we know that now. So there were a lot of positives that were coming out of the movement of urbanization, but there were also a lot of negatives. But this again gave an opportunity for some interesting developments in literature. There begins to be literature that's kind of social criticism, or that's highlighting problems in society. In particular in France, Francois Villon, who I believe he lived in Paris, and he was also a convicted criminal, but he was an author, and he described a lot of the really negative parts of medieval life in the city, and that really highlighted the problems and made people aware of them. And that is something that literature can do, is to make people aware of issues that exist in the world. And so you can see that everything that we've been talking about that's been happening historically is having an impact on the development of literature during this time. And it is a rich time period that's producing new literature and experimenting with new things in various different ways. All of these changes that happen as a result of the increased trade and education and so forth that come about as a result of some of this stuff from the Crusades, all of this stuff begins to have an impact, and slowly, gradually, medieval life begins to transform. Increased commerce, increased learning, increased exploration by various European nations gradually launched Europe into a new era that we know as the Renaissance. We will, of course, the Renaissance will be our next unit of study, and we will get to that. It is important to note that there's not a clear date when the medieval period ends and the Renaissance begins. The Renaissance is considered to have begun much earlier in Southern Europe, especially in Italy, but in some of the other Southern European nations as well. But the Renaissance begins much later in some of the Northern European nations like England. So the Renaissance kind of begins in the 1300s in Italy, but it doesn't really begin until the 1500s in England. So it's a very gradual change, and it takes place over time. But gradually we move from kind of what we consider the medieval period into the Renaissance that is characterized by a rediscovery of all the Greek and Latin literature and their impact on the culture, and is an increase in scientific discovery and study, exploration, and all of these sorts of things. So I just want to leave you with some of the primary characteristics of the medieval period in their literature. It was a time of variety and complexity. It's not a simple dark age, right? It's not just a Middle Ages, but it's a time that's producing original work that is interesting and has had a significant impact on our literature today and the way that we view the world. Their literature primarily reflects these vacillations between faith and doubt. Faith and doubt are two really important issues, and that's really embodied in the quest narrative. And the quest narrative takes many different forms in medieval literature. One of the most famous quests is the search for the Holy Grail, and that is a very spiritual journey, and there is lots of description of spiritual faith and doubt there as well. A more kind of mythical journey of this is the hunt for the unicorn. That's a common story and narrative in medieval literature. And so the idea of looking for the unicorn, and that's an issue of faith, but also an issue of purity, right? Only a pure virgin young woman could get the unicorn to come to her. Right? And so there is that kind of idea of the quest, and there's a spiritual dimension to that as well. Obviously, I mentioned earlier, and we're going to read about Dante Alighieri's journey towards salvation, which he symbolically represents as a journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven. That is a quest of faith and doubt as well. So the quest is a central piece of medieval literature, faith, purity, and doubt are also central themes that they wrestle with. These are very different themes from what we saw in ancient Greece and even in ancient Rome. These are very, very different ideas. And so I hope that that helps you to see how unique and original medieval literature is. All right, guys, thanks for sticking with me through the lecture. I know it's long, but keep in mind we would have been doing this in class for an hour anyways. It's a little bit over an hour right now, but I'm going to give you a few days to get through this lecture. Make sure you watch all the lecture. You can feel free to take notes. You can obviously come back and re-watch the lecture. In the next couple days, I will be posting some new assignments that we're going to do with medieval literature. For now, just read the lecture and then, not read the lecture, listen to the lecture. You can read the notes on the slides, but pay attention to that and then leave a submission on the lecture. I'm going to give you some instructions on what to submit in the instructions on the assignment. And then head over to the discussion boards and look and see if you can find a coat of arms, family crest for your family name. And if you can, post an image there. If you can't, go over and look and see what other people have posted. All right, guys, I hope you have a great couple days, and I will see you with some more work here very soon.